Hello, Assalamualaikum. Welcome back to my video. In my previous video, we already discussed on number 1, 2 and 3. Now let's move to number 4, which is the glycolysis. So glycolysis is the first process in cellular respiration. Okay, in glycolysis, the word glyco referring to the glucose, while the word lysis referring to the breakdown. So the definition of glycolysis is the splitting of sugar or breakdown of glucose. Glucose contains 6 carbon atom into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Pyruvate contains 3 carbon atom. And then glycolysis happen in the cytoplasm of the cell. And during glucose breakdown, there is production of 2 pyruvate. And of course, there is a formation of ATP and also the NADH. Glycolysis contains 2 phases. The first phase known as energy investment phase, and then second phase known as energy payoff phase. During first phase, the glucose is converted into glyceraldehyde, 3-phosphate, and there is use of ATP. And then second phase, the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is converted into pyruvate and there is production of ATP. So in glycolysis, there are 10 steps and each step is catalyzed by specific reaction. Now, let's take a look on the first phase first, which is the energy investment phase. So step number 1, glucose, which is in the cytoplasm of the cell, is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. This reaction catalyzed by enzyme hexokinase. The word kinase is referring to the transferring of a phosphate group into a reactant, which is the glucose. So where does phosphate group coming from? It comes from ATP. So ATP donates a phosphate group into glucose and glucose becomes glucose 6-phosphate. So what happened to ATP? It lost a phosphate group and it becomes ADP. Okay, step number 2, glucose 6-phosphate is converted into its isomer, which is fructose 6-phosphate. This reaction catalyzed by phosphoglucoisomerase enzyme. Okay, and then step number 3, fructose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and this reaction catalyzed by phosphofructokinase, another kinase. So it means another phosphate group is being added to fructose 6-phosphate. So ATP donates a phosphate group into fructose 6-phosphate and becomes fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So ATP lost a phosphate group and becomes ADP. Look at the diagram. The location of phosphate group is in carbon number 1 and carbon number 6 of fructose. Okay, step number 4. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is split into 2 molecules of 3 carbon atom, which is dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and another one is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And this reaction catalyzed by aldolase enzyme. And then step number 5 is the dihydroxyacetone phosphate is converted into its isomer, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So now, in step number 5, we have 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Noted that in energy investment phase, there are 2 molecules of ATP is used to convert glucose into 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Now, let's move to the second phase of glycolysis, which is energy payoff phase. Keep in mind that every molecule of glucose is split into 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So every reaction in second phase, it happened twice and the reaction and product is twice. Okay, so next step number 6 is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is converted into 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. There is 2 processes here. Number 1 is the addition of phosphate group into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay, and then second process is the oxidation of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So oxidation process of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate cause NAD to reduce and form NADH, and this reaction catalyzed by enzyme glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Okay, next step 7 is 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is converted into 3-phosphoglycerate, whereby 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is losing one phosphate group. This reaction catalyzed by phosphoglycerokinase, so another word kinase. So where does the phosphate group go? So the phosphate group is being added or being transferred into ADP. So ADP becomes ATP. Okay. Next is step number 8. The 3-phosphoglycerate is rearranged into 2-phosphoglycerate. This reaction catalyzed by phosphoglyceromutase. Look at the location of phosphate group. Phosphate group in carbon number 3 is moving to the carbon number 2 in 2-phosphoglycerate. Okay, step number 9 is 2-phosphoglycerate is converted into phosphoenolpyruvate by enzyme enolase. There are removal of water molecules. And then the final step is phosphoenolpyruvate is converted into pyruvate by pyruvate kinase. So there is a transferring of a phosphate group from phosphoenolpyruvate into ADP. So ADP becomes ATP. Okay, noted that in energy payoff phase, there is production of ATP. How many ATP? 4 ATP and another 2 NADH produced. So let's summarize. Glycolysis happens in cytoplasm. Then there is overall equation for glycolysis. So the net yields of ATP produced during glycolysis is 2. Why 2 ATP? Because during energy payoff phase, there is 4 ATP produced from one molecule of glucose. But since there is usage or utilize of 2 ATP during energy investment phase, so we deduct 2 ATP from 4 ATP. So we get 2 ATP in net. So net molecule of ATP produced during glycolysis from one molecule of glucose is 2 ATP. And also, glycolysis produces 2 NADH per glucose molecule, and ADH will enter electron transport chain in step number 4 or process number 4.